Muy buenas tardes, very good afternoon to everyone. I am delighted to be here today in the company of two very distinguished thinkers, very outspoken thinkers, Jodi Dean, Todd May, in this session, which is the second of three, in which we will be discussing whether there is such a thing as a post-neoliberal order. This should be a constructive dialogue, a constructive conversation in which we try to explore what comes next. Sort of, is there life after death, and is there life after debt? That was a very frequent phrase during the debt crisis in the 80s and 90s in Latin America. Well, now we should think, is there life after neoliberalism, and what is that going to look like? Both Jodi and Todd May have been very, very thoughtful and provoking in their thoughts on these subjects. And I think Mexico is also at the center of one of the many branches of this discussion today. So I am thrilled that the Feria Internacional del Libro, that the Center for Latin American Studies, CALAS, and that the Universidad de Guadalajara would be hosting, supporting, and promoting this group of conversations on this topic. And without further ado, I am Gabriel Guerra. I am going to be moderating and provoking today. And I would love to welcome, if I may, in strict alphabetical order, Jodi Dean, who is currently in Geneva, on this side of the Atlantic in New York. Thank you, Jodi.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be part of this conversation. I want to start out by giving a little bit of context and definition to this very popular term, neoliberalism. It's typically associated with privatization and marketization, often linked to the post-welfare state, to post-Keynesianism. We could add in here its connections with globalization. Then there's also austerity or precarity capitalism, which we can think of as neoliberalism viewed from below. Other designations that are part of our economic and political present focus more on digital networks and information, and so add in terms like platform capitalism, cognitive capitalism, communicative capitalism, digital capitalism, and then surveillance and algorithmic capitalism. We can also add to this list of designations of our political economic present Brett Christopher's new discussion of rentier capitalism. And this is a form where accumulation strategies involve having rather than doing. Finally, as part of the sort of terminological list of these critical ideas of contemporary capitalism, we might add in those that focus on climate change and see definitions like social capitalism or carbon capitalism or the capitalist scene. Now, all of these different terms for present economic society also need to be connected not just with our present understanding, but with earlier designations like imperialism, monopoly capitalism, and finance capitalism. They also accompany a vocabulary of racial capitalism and patriarchal capitalism. And this vocabulary tries to draw out the ways that economic exploitation always depends on sex and race depression. Finally, as we sort of proliferate this archive of terms for the present economic and political formation, we should keep in mind that they're accompanied by a bunch of terms that say we've moved beyond capitalism altogether, as you implied in the introduction. Paul Mason, for example, is one of those who suggested that our era is post-capitalist. Slavoj Žižek has offered the term liberal communism as the name for that elite associated with Bill Gates and George Soros. Žižek perversely here posits their philanthropy as a kind of capitalist self-negation, writing, Today's capitalism cannot reproduce itself on its own. It needs extra economic charity to sustain the cycle of social reproduction. We might as well add into this list then Anthropocene as another post-capitalist name, particularly given its uptake among critical theorists, insofar as Anthropocene signals a move beyond political economy to the epochal and geologic, to something outside the time of human production altogether. Now, these different names are connected with different analyses and different politics. The terms point to different sets of problems, dynamics, property relations, power relations, sites of struggle, and so on. To my mind, the best theorizations specifically of neoliberalism are those that describe it as a reactionary class response, as a class project of wealth appropriation. And here, Gerard Dumenil and Dominique Levy are really strong. Also, Robert Brenner, right? Brenner is great on this because he gives us neoliberalism as the politically driven upward redistribution of wealth. I'll say this one more time because it's really, really essential. The politically driven upward redistribution of wealth. And what's so important here is that it recognizes the neoliberal use of the state, what Paul Passavant has theorized as a strong neoliberal state. So neoliberalism has been a counter-revolutionary project, a reaction of the capitalist class to declining rates of profits and the social upheaval of the 60s and 70s. It was never just about markets and free trade. My cat's trying to help participate in this conversation. It's never been just about markets and free trade. It's always been a state project that involves using the state, state laws, interstate treaties, financial regulations, and institutions to redistribute wealth from the middle to the top. Now, my view is that neoliberalism is being replaced by something worse, what I call neofeudalism. More precisely, capitalism's own dynamics are turning in on themselves in a kind of absolute subsumption with new kinds of lordship and servitude, new lords and new serfs, a micro elite of platform billionaires, and a massive service sector or sector of servants. My wager is that neo-feudalism gives us an image of the present that lets us make sense of contemporary inequality, finance, fragmentation, flexible platforms and service labor, and the crises of social reproduction. It lets us see all of these as interrelated elements of a single tendency because it gives that tendency a name, right? It says it's neo-feudal. So all those different terms that I began with actually name different aspects of what we need to see as a whole formation, right? What we need to see in terms of neo-feudalization as a tendency. The combination of monopoly concentration, intensified inequality, and the subjection of the state to the market are resulting in a neo-feudalism where accumulation occurs as much through rent, debt, and political power as it does through commodity production. Globally, in the knowledge and tech industries, for example, rental income accruing from intellectual property rights exceeds income from the production of goods. In the US, financial services contribute more to GDP than manufactured goods do. Increasingly, capital's not reinvested in production, it's hoarded, it's eaten up or redistributed as rents. So value is decreasingly self-valorizing, right? To use the terms from Capital, right? Value is not self-valorizing anymore. It can't do it. Valorization processes have spread far beyond the factory into complex, speculative, and unstable circuits, increasingly dependent on surveillance, coercion, and violence. By calling these tendencies in our present neo-feudal, I'm also signaling a change, not just in this kind of production part, in the capital accumulation part. I want to signal a change in labor relations. Today, the ideal of freely contracted labor that justifies and conceals coercive class relations is untenable, right? It's not concealed anymore. Not even the barest fantasy of freely given consent accounts for the social relations of capital accumulation today. Most folks have no choice but to work. And many of us have no work to choose. In the service-dominated economies of the global north, majorities work in service sectors. Some find that their phones, bikes, cars, and homes have lost their character as personal property and been transformed into means of production or for the extraction of rent. Tethered to platforms owned by others, consumer items and means of life are now means for the platform owner's accumulation. Some of us enjoy the fantasy that our service is creative, that we are members of a privileged class of knowledge workers. Yet much of that work is increasingly done for free, maybe with a chance of pay. Knowledge workers, like day laborers, often have to compete for contracts. And if we win, then we get to work for a wage. Most of us constitute a propertyless underclass, only able to survive by servicing the needs of high earners. For instance, as the teachers and instructors of their children, their personal assistants, their trainers, their tutors, their cooks, or their cleaners. Over the next 10 years, the occupation that is predicted to add the most jobs is personal care aides, not health workers, but aides who bathe and clean people. Another age would call them servants. The waged are further expropriated of our minimal incomes via unavoidable debts, fees, fines, and rents. In the US, for example, taxes on people are redistributed to corporations. For example, in 2018, 57 corporations, including Amazon, not only didn't pay taxes, but they got tax rebates. They got money back. So the US government squeezes its citizens for money to pay back to corporations. The neo-feudal hypothesis does not imply that contemporary communicative or networked capitalism identically reproduces the features of European feudalism. That's not the argument. In fact, historians have successfully demonstrated that the very idea of a single European feudalism is a fiction. Different feudalisms developed across the continent in response to different pressures. And that's just Europe, right? There's feudal relations in all sorts of countries. Viewing contemporary capitalism in terms of feudalizing tendencies, then it's not about the past. It's about looking at a new socioeconomic structure that has four interlocking features. So these four interlocking features are parcellated sovereignty, new lords and serfs, hinterlandization, and a kind of catastrophism. That's the affective version. I'm going to say a little bit more about these four and then close. So the first attribute of neo-feudalism, parcellated sovereignty, refers to the blending together of political and economic power in the context of a generalized fragmentation. So if we think about old school feudalism, we imagine lots of little fiefdoms where lords ruled. They extract surplus from peasants through legal coercion, and the coercion's legal because the lords are the ones who make the rules over those in their domains. In today's version, private commercial interests displace public law. Confidentiality agreements, non-compete rules, compulsory arbitration, the dismantling of public regulatory agencies, and so on, give private entities power that was previously exercised by the state. Further contemporary examples of fragmentation and the merger of state and economic authority, characteristic of the parcelization of sovereignty, include the fact that 10% of global wealth is hoarded in offshore accounts to avoid taxation. That is, to escape the reach of state law. Law doesn't apply to billionaires powerful enough to evade it. Libertarians try to gin up enthusiasm for cryptocurrencies. Why? So that the currencies can avoid any kind of state regulation, any kind of state law, any kind of taxation, any kind of state power. Another example, the largest tech companies have valuations greater than the economies of most of the world's countries. So cities and states relate to Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, and Google as if these corporations were themselves sovereign states. Cities negotiate with them, they try to attract them, and they compete, and they cooperate with these different firms on terms that the firms set. Immense concentrated wealth has its own constituent power, the power to constitute the rules it will follow or not. A final example, foreign investors have the right to sue state governments in international tribunals. And they often do this when public interest regulations that are designed to protect water, communities, and the environment threaten to reduce the value of their investments. Right? And a large number of these cases have been brought by Canadian mining exploration firms against Latin American governments. So I've been emphasizing just this one aspect of neo-feudalism, parcellated sovereignty. There are three other aspects. Like the second one is these new lords and serfs, and I associate that with platforms like Uber that supply servants to the privileged class. The next attribute is hinterlandization. And by that, I want to designate the kind of sites of loss or the desolated landscapes of abandonment that house giant distribution and call centers and the decaying housing and transportation infrastructures that mark neo-feudalism. Politically, we see this fact of hinterlandization manifest in the renewed interest in social reproduction and the crisis of care. Hinterlandization, in other words, marks the loss of a general capacity to reproduce the conditions of livable life. And it appears in rising suicide rates, drug overdoses, and in the US, the psychotic societal self-destruction of mass shootings. Right? It appears in collapsed infrastructures, undrinkable water, and unbreathable air. And then the fourth characteristic of neo-feudalism is this affect, the overwhelming affect of catastrophism and despair. And I can go into more detail in this in the discussion. But to conclude, my claim is not a historical one about feudalism's fundamental structure. This is not a return of the repressed. Rather, it's that neo-feudalism lets us make sense of changes in the present. It lets us change how we view capitalism today. Seen in light of neo-feudalization, fragmentation appears as a feature of the current setting. It's not to be embraced as some kind of democratic pluralization or the multitude of singularities, right? It's a component of the new structuring of economic and political power. Likewise, the rejection of reason and embrace of mysticism aren't indicative of creative flourishing. They correspond to the fears and anxieties of catastrophism and apocalypticism. So, in sum, my view is that neoliberalism is no longer an adequate term for the present. We're living in something worse, neo-feudalism.
Thank you. Jodi, that is I think, very thought-provoking, but also I think it's very helpful to talk about what it is that we find ourselves in and that we are supposedly exiting or not. I couldn't help but remember a very controversial text at the time on the more perhaps on the more shallow end of political analysis, which was this so-called end of history by Fukuyama. And how I remember I was at the time I was living in the Soviet Union and seeing what the decline of the Soviet Union was about. You couldn't help but wonder if anyone had bothered to look, for example, at the Central Asian republics, which today happen to be some of the most devolved and at the same time richest former regions of the Soviet Union. But I think what we've missed all along is the concept of evolving history at different paces across the world, and how, yes, whether we find ourselves in the neo-feudalism that you describe, whether we find ourselves elsewhere, and Todd will hopefully help shed some light on where we are and what we should be thinking about. The basic point I think we should bear in mind is that even, whether it's neoliberalism, whether it's capitalism with a social conscience, or social democracy as we saw it in Europe in the 70s, 80s, whether it is neo-feudalism, it is practiced and experienced in radically different ways across the world. I think many of the things you described today from a Mexican perspective can be seen anywhere from the high rises of the Santa Fe business district in Mexico City to the coffee plantations in Chiapas or Oaxaca, where everyone is living their own brave new version of neofeudalism or whatever it is we find ourselves in. Todd, what is happening to thought in this process? Because the economic impact of what we're living through is, I think, clear for all to see. Obviously, the pandemic has been an accelerator, for good, for bad. If we believe in the concept of collapsing the status quo as a way to transform it, then perhaps the pandemic has been the most dramatic social agent of the last 50 years. But what is happening to thought? What is happening to education? What is happening to the whole concept of learning? And when I say learning, I am not only referring to education, but referring to life as a whole. We have never had so much access to so much information, yet the concentration of knowledge, just like the concentration of riches, appears to be the most unequal in recent history. What can you tell us about that and about anything else you may want to open with?
Good. Well, first, let me thank you for moderating, and Jodi for the analysis. There was a lot put on the table in a short period of time, and I really appreciate that. I was going to talk about two things, but I'm going to sort of defocus on one and focus more on the other, and then get back to the education question, because I think it's related to the second thing. So I wanted to talk about first the political and social, and I'm going to talk about that more briefly because Jodi did a really good job of sorting some of that out. And second, what we might call the constitution of people, how people are constituted, how they're created under different kinds of conditions. So that's where I'll focus a little bit more. And I want to use two terms. One term, of course, is neoliberalism. And the other term I want to introduce, and it's just a bit of a placeholder term, I'm going to call it the new nationalism. And in some sense, it's not new, and in some sense, it's not nationalist. But at least it will help give us some initial grip on what I'm trying to get at, particularly around the constitution of people. So one of the things that Jodi was on about was the role of the state in the earlier neoliberal period. Because I think there's a story that sometimes gets told around the new nationalism. And for new nationalism, you can think of figures like Trump and Orban and what's going on with Brexit, that the story that gets told is that we used to be in an unrestrained, corporatized, globalized world, and that's screwing around the people in this country or in that country. And what we need to do is take care of our own first. That we need to take care of Americans before we worry about the rest of the world. And so it's seen as a reaction to globalization, right? And the idea that corporations rather than states are controlling things. But as Jodi points out, that's not actually true. That states have been very involved with the Washington Consensus in neoliberalism, and states are very involved now. So I don't think this is a movement, that the shift that we're seeing from a dominance of neoliberalism to an emergence of what I'm calling new nationalism, as a shift from focus on corporate globalization to focus on, let's say, the internal politics of a state, because they have always been woven together. There is something going on around, there's a shift going on that has something to do with economics. And I think Jodi has detailed it some. But I don't think that what it is what we're often told it is, which is we're going to take care of our own now and quit worrying about the rest of the world. With that, let me shift to this idea of the constitution of people, because that's something that Jodi didn't talk about, and maybe I have a little contribution to make here. Neoliberalism, the way in which it tried to constitute people was, as Foucault uses the term homoeconomicus, that each of us is entrepreneurs of ourselves. This comes largely out of the Chicago School of Economics, tracing back to Theodore Schultz, right, and his concept of human capital. So the idea is that what human beings are bundles of capital, and it's not just money capital, right? People's athletic skills and is capital, their intelligence is capital, their educational level is capital. And so what human beings do is each of us invests our capital for some sort of return. That return can be monetary, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. It can be meaningfulness, it can be further education, it can be for your family or your friends, but that what we are fundamentally entrepreneurs of ourselves. Now, in some of my writing, I've had the idea that I think there's actually another kind of figure here in neoliberalism, not just the entrepreneur, but also the consumer, that we see ourselves in many ways, or we are encouraged to see ourselves as consumers. So in classes where people have taught, professors have sometimes said that students will be on their laptops, and if they're not as entertaining as what's going on their laptop, but people will look at their laptop. So, but both of these, the consumer and the entrepreneur, these are very economic concepts. They encourage us to think about ourselves in economic ways. And there's a way in which neoliberalism was very good at producing neoliberal people. Because if you want to create a person that thinks of themselves as human capital, investing for some kind of return, one thing you can do is you can stop giving them any social help. You can throw them out on their own. And when you start throwing people out on their own, they're going to think, okay, what are my resources and how can I best invest those resources to continue to survive? So some of the withdrawal from the public sector, the privatization, the deregulation associated with neoliberalism was very good at producing neoliberal individuals. But here's where I think what I'm calling the new nationalism is involving a shift. Now, it's not that this has displaced neoliberalism, but rather I think it's alongside it in a way that withdraws some of the domination of the neoliberal individualist economic thinking about who we are. And this is thinking about ourselves in terms of national categories, but by national categories, I want to say largely group categories, not just US, but deeply things like white folks, and having a sense of who it is that we are as a group. So rather than thinking of ourselves as individuals investing in a market of other individuals, there's a sense of group identity being promoted. And that group identity is going to have a deeply racist aspect to it. A friend of mine who was talking about identity politics and the charge that the left descends often into identity politics, which I actually have some sympathy with it. He said, well, actually, he says, if you look historically, right, the most successful identity politics movements, white folks, right, they're really good at having a sense of identity, right? So what I think we're seeing alongside and in some sense in tension with the neoliberal individual is a new sense of who I am that is rooted in a sense of myself as a member of a certain cultural group. And that membership in a cultural group gives me a sense of meaning and gives me a sense of identity. And one of the things that it can do, and this I think will intersect with something that Jodi said earlier, is if I'm thinking about myself as a member of a group and taking my identity from that group membership, I'm pulling away a bit from the economic struggle because I'm seeing my meaning as arising somewhere else. And I think that what, for instance, in our country, what Trump did as president was he spoke to people about their economic marginalization. but didn't do anything about it. In fact, he helped corporations. But at the same time, the rhetoric that he employed encouraged people to think of themselves as members of, let's say, displaced white folks who are entitled to more than they get. And the problem is that you have these immigrants coming in, right, and these black folks who won't work. And so we have to think of ourselves as a group with a certain identity. There's an us there. And what's called Trump's base, what unites Trump's base, is not just economic. In fact, I think it crosses a number of economic lines. I think what unites Trump's base is a sense of, we could say, cultural whiteness, right? And that, I think, is the new nationalism. But it's going to, if we're thinking about ourselves that way, and if we're taking meaning that way, then it's going to have several different implications. Right? One is that it's going to defocus on any economic struggle. It's going to encourage you to think not economically, but to think, say, racially and culturally. So that will be one of its effects. Right? And the other thing is this. If we move away from the economic realm, it's often, I think, and it's a question that, and this is the philosophical question, right? It's a question that of what makes life meaningful for us. And if we think that what makes life meaningful for us is what we get in return for our investments, we're going to live very differently from if we think of the meaningfulness of my life is to be, culturally like other white folks. I think we're going to act differently under those conditions. And now, just to wind it up, Gabriel, let me just turn to this idea of education and thought, because I think we're seeing the new nationalism here. The critique in the US of what's called critical race theory, right? As though kids in grade school are studying legal scholars on issues of race. This, I think, is a project in the new nationalism to get people to think about themselves in certain ways. Right? But when you take a text like Toni Morrison's Beloved, right, not just one of the great novels in the U.S., one of the great novels of the 20th century, right, and say that is a divisive piece of literature which we should not be reading because it calls out issues of race and violence and things like that, you're encouraging white folks to think about themselves in a certain way, right? Which is going to involve the marginalization of African Americans. And one thing, of course, Jodi, I think would quickly point out, and I wouldn't disagree, is that also can have the effect of, like a lot of these strategies, splitting working class folks, right? That's one thing it can do. But I think also it shifts how we think about the meaningfulness of our lives in ways that would have effects that I think are going to be hard to tell. I mean, I have to confess a little bit of hesitation in my discussing this, because I always feel like when I'm talking about what's happening, like to try to analyze what's happening in the present, I feel like I'm playing a fool's game, right? Like it's easier to look back and say, okay, here's where we went, than to say, here's where we're going. I think Jodi gave a really eloquent, right, proposal for this. But I feel like something's happening here alongside the nationalism, alongside the neoliberalism, with this new nationalism. So you see neoliberalism still having its effect in things like how we react to COVID. So how are we reacting to COVID in the U.S.? We're all individuals. We're all free. We can do what we want. I don't answer to anybody. Right? I think that's a neoliberal hangover. But we also see the new nationalism in ways associating oneself with certain groups.
Thank you. Thank you, Todd. I think this concept that you're putting on the table, the new nationalism as a distractor, if I understood correctly, and this idea of rhetorical empowerment as opposed to real empowerment of different sectors, but especially of the middle class or of the working class, I think is particularly relevant. In the U.S., the ascent of Trump can be very easily explained and understood by the decline of the middle class at a period of great creation of wealth and great accumulation of wealth. And at the same time, at the slow ascent, but real, even though very slow, of the poorer sectors of the social fabric, which resulted in the middle classes feeling further away than ever of their aspirational goal of the Joneses, and more threatened by those that they used to look down upon, and that were suddenly moving into their neighborhoods, competing with them for jobs, what have you. So this concentration of wealth, and I think the U.S. is a prime example because of its size. Mexico, we say, doesn't sing too poorly in that choir. To try to paraphrase a Mexican saying, "No cantamos mal las rancheras." Mexico has one of the most unequal distributions of wealth in the world, which has not changed. And again, I would like to go back to this idea of COVID as a social accelerator, social political accelerator, in the sense that it's made us more and more aware of these disparities, the global, the local, the regional. In Mexico, it was all about who could travel to the US to get vaccinated and who was willing at the beginning, especially, to flout the rules of the US in order to do it. And then afterwards, who was able to do it, legally, officially. Sort of, again, even migration, has different levels, and even vaccination has social classes to deal with. But again, COVID has seen some of the greatest creations of wealth in recent history. And all we need to do is look at Silicon Valley, just as one example, or Amazon, or what have you. And what we as consumers saw as liberating, to be able to order anything off the internet and receive it at home quickly without any risk, resulted in a new class of serfs, which, for all practical reasons, at least in Mexico, and I believe also in the US, work with social security and absolutely no benefits to speak of, sort of as errand runners. That is the greatest job creation that has come along. So the threat of new nationalism, I saw it up close in Europe. It's alive and well all over the place. How do we counteract that? How do we go away from this? Because we all like to say, "Oh, this only happens somewhere else. This only happens to the Poles or to the Hungarians or to the Croats, or, well, okay, yes, the Germans, but the Germans, they've got a grip on it. And yes, well, the Americans, but the Americans." And then we turn around and we see our neighbor engaging in that same thing. So how do we deal with that? And how do we deal with this concentration of wealth that becomes concentration of prejudice and ignorance, and that perpetuates? I like that part where you spoke of how the perpetuation of neoliberals, neoliberalism creating more neoliberals. Although I think the silver lining in that, if it is silver, is that neoliberalism was not able, and I'm using the term, Jodi, don't look at me askance, please, not that you are. I'm using it just for terms of simplicity in this conversation. Neoliberalism cannot perpetuate itself because it has not been able to satisfy a sufficient number of individuals in the world. At the end of the day, it sought to perpetuate itself, as you stated, Todd, but it is actually fighting itself on its own turf, in terms of, it's creating many more poor than actual beneficiaries of the model. how do we deal with that? And we have limited time for all humanity, but us in the session. So we should maybe have a back and forth on. I'm not sure if Lenin is my go-to quote usually, but in this case, definitely. What do we do?
Good. Can I?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. No. A clarification, and then I'm going to turn, Jodi. I'll turn to you for the question of what we do, and then I'll come back to that because I have some thoughts. But maybe they'll just bounce off of you. So one clarification, Gabriel, that it's true that the new nationalism is a distractor, but I don't want to say its sole function is to be a distractor. I think that would be too reductionist. To give you one example, I think that there are certain kinds of powers that white folks get thinking of themselves as groups of white folks. There are ways that they get to think about themselves. They can be more openly discriminatory toward other folks, people of color, and so while the new nationalism distracts from the kinds of economic exploitation that's going on, which means it just allows it to continue. On the other hand, I think it does give some forms of non-economic power. I mean, I'm not endorsing this kind of power, of course, but it gives some kinds of power to people if they take their meaningfulness in their subcultural identity and then can marginalize other cultural identities. That's a form of power, and it's not reducible to economic power, although it intersects with it. That was a clarification. Yeah.
Yes, I agree. And it was probably more my interpretation of nationalism, regionalism, racialism as distracting factors, which have, a richness, quote unquote, unto themselves. But Jodi, please.
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned Lenin, because I actually think, and particularly since we don't have much time either here or in a global historical sense, the actual most pragmatic answer is the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism. That seems like a tall order, but in fact, widespread disruption, the growing tensions, the problems right now in Europe around all of the people who are migrating and refugees, the problems in the Western Hemisphere, we see lots of social upheaval that climate change and economic inequality are only going to get worse. So I actually think that we know the answer for dealing with the problems of the concentrations of wealth, and that is overthrow of capitalism. You said neoliberalism can't satisfy, wide numbers of individuals. That was never the goal. Right. This is why I really think that the interpretations of neoliberalism that recognize that it was always part of a capitalist reaction to the social welfare state and declining rate of profit are crucial. Right. We have to know it was always capital's interest in maintaining its own power, in seizing for itself what is made by the many. And these sort of trillions of dollars of wealth that have been created in the last year or two, I actually think we have to recognize as forms of fictitious capital, that as soon as the markets collapse, as soon as state governments stop feeding money into the markets, this will all collapse and it will vanish. And the reality of what's produced, the reality of what's needed will reassert itself. I mean, that's at the very beginning of COVID in the United States, everybody talked about essential workers and valuing essential workers. And then later on, it's like, we're tired of valuing essential workers. We just want to value our goodies from Amazon. Then that took over more. But the answers are only complicated if you presume the continuation of the societies and economies we have. If you take the actuality of revolution as your perspective, then the problems actually simplify.
Yes, although we could perhaps argue, and I don't want to distract from the core of this discussion, that capitalism did have a moment there where it appeared to be actually thinking, a thinking being, a sentient being, and promoted a series of policies that would have made it tenable in the very long run. I'm thinking Social Security, I'm thinking the European models. And this time around, it came back, again, beginning in the 90s with, call it the Washington Consensus, call it the Chicago Boys, call it what you will, with a completely brazen and shameless face of itself, if we could put it that way. And that, any Trotskyite would be delighted to see capitalism actually acting as the agent of its own subversion, eventual subversion, if that is what comes to be. I'm a pessimist, and I tend to think that capitalism has a way of reinventing itself all the time. But anyway, I'm not the guest here. I'm just the facilitator. So, Todd, what would Lenin have us do? Or what would anyone have us do?
Yeah, I'm going to leave Lenin to the experts on Lenin. I'm a little bit, I'm less optimistic about revolution than Jodi is, and the reason is, well, I suppose I'm less optimistic about people, in part that when the when things panned out with neoliberalism and a number of white workers got displaced, it was very easy to get them to embrace a reactionary whiteness rather than to look at how it is that capitalism has helped undermine their livelihoods. So for me, if there is going to be a revolution, I worry that's going to go in the wrong direction. I worry that it's going to be a right-wing revolution embracing a form of authoritarianism that's not going to allow us to move forward. What I think the new nationalism, one of the things that it offers us, is when there is group solidarity, that offers a solidarity not only to the dominant group, but there can be a solidarity to the marginalized groups. So when, for instance, African Americans are encouraged under neoliberalism to think of themselves as entrepreneurs, that undermines any solidarity that they might have. I mean, it's not that there was none, but that way of thinking undermines solidarity. But if African Americans as a group are getting marginalized, right, immigrants as a group are getting marginalized, right, then there can be, as there was in the US, an internal sense of collective identity that can garner, right, solidarity and allyship and allow people to move forward. So I think that the collective cultural aspect of the new nationalism actually offers potential tools for change on the ground by the collective sense of identity that folks will have, right, with one another. But in order for that to happen, I think what we need to do is avoid what I call the mistakes of the 90s, which was the siloing of so many of these movements. They have to see themselves in solidarity with one another. And seeing themselves in solidarity with one another, right, struggle against the particular but intersecting ways in which the in which the new nationalism in concert with neoliberalism, right, has worked. Now, Jodi might look at me and say, "Well, isn't that revolution?" Right? My
Well,
suspicion, is it's something like what I want to. I suspect would be more like a radical reformism than a revolution. Although
now,
where one dips,
is revolution per se a good thing, Jodi, or do we need to look for the right kind of revolution?
Of course, revolution by itself isn't enough. It has to go in the correct direction. And so I would advocate for a socialist revolution or a communist revolution. I think that what we can say for sure is that revolution is on the horizon. And then the question is, are we organized enough to push it in the direction it should go? I have a question for Todd. I think, when I hear you talk about new nationalism, I get it as a kind of a compensatory mechanism for the harms of neoliberalism, but it's also hard for me to extract it from the larger patterns of US history, where identity politics, of course, were already becoming a thing in the 80s, like way before Trump. I mean, honestly, my very first book written in the 90s, the early 90s, was like Solidarity of Strangers After Identity Politics. Boy, like, talk about, you can't predict the future. I said after identity politics 30 years ago. And in fact, the last 30 years have very much been years of identity politics, no after at all. I mean, we know that throughout the 20th century, there were forms of African American organizing, forms of Afro-nationalism as a way of confronting racism and lynch law and Jim Crow. But then there was also the Communist Party that worked very hard to build cross-racial alliances. It worked very hard with, to try to integrate some unions, right? The unions that were amenable to it, to try to form the class power across races. I mean, the Communist Party recognized.
Let me just interrupt you there, Jodi. This concept of comrades that you've written about, but I have someone buzzing in my ear, threatening me with a sledgehammer because we're very close to finishing. So before I ask you both to wrap up with final conclusions, I just want to throw a little wrench in there on the concept of human solidarity or group solidarity. I'm a skeptic of human nature and of humankind in general. Todd, I would just remind you that one of the sectors where Donald Trump fared best in the last election was among Latinos, and that he did exceptionally well among Mexican Americans living legally in the US, who were the most outspoken proponents of tighter immigration laws. So, so much for group identity and group solidarity. But anyway, since you're deal with repercussions of the feed closer to home, we're going to need to wrap up with final thoughts from both of you. This conversation could go on for several hours, and I'm sure we would keep the audience with us. This is fascinating, but unfortunately, we are subjects of another slave master, the clock. So, Todd, if you would like to reply to Jodi, and then at the same time give us your closing thoughts, and then Jodi, you give us some final parting words, please.
Good. So I want to just pick up on what Jodi said. Because remember, Jodi, I said the new nationalism, in some sense, it's not really new, right? And I think that's right. You've pointed to ways in which it's not. I think it's surging in an overt way that it hasn't surged before. But Jodi, I've spent the last 30 years in South Carolina, right?
I was born in South Carolina.
Well, my condolences for that. And so you well know, right? That in the 19th century, right, white identity politics did quite well here, and so it's when I'm pointing to that is not saying this is a new phenomenon, but rather I think there's a certain surging that's emphasizing that. And you're right, it didn't start with Trump, but I think it was coming, and I think Trump and the pre-Trump Republican Party. I think we're building on that and trying to and sort of throwing stuff on the fire. But just to close, I don't want to add anything new because this conversation has been so rich. So let me just I want to thank Jodi. This is the second time I've been on a panel with Jodi, and I always wind up learning bunches from her. And I want to thank you, Gabriel. For the provocations, which were gentle. It's just been an honor to be here, and I hope that what we've done is not so much said, okay, now you don't need to think about this anymore, but just thrown some ideas out there that can allow people to think and perhaps correct and change and modify an important conversation about where we are now. that is crucial, and that, as Jodi pointed out, we don't have a terrible lot of time around.
I think that's the whole point of provoking, precisely. No, getting people to continue talking and thinking about this after the session ends. Jodi, please, if you would wrap up for us what has been definitely for me a fascinating conversation.
I've enjoyed it a lot, and I've learned so much. Todd, I was particularly happy that you were talking about the constitution of people, because when I've been presenting this material on Neofeudalism, people keep asking me about the subject and about people, and that's still on the drawing board. And so you've given me a lot to think about, to help me fill out that part of this project. You all both identified as pessimist. I'll continue our lively debate and take the other side, the side of what I would call revolutionary optimism. I actually think that history shows that working and oppressed people can pull together and dramatically overthrow their conditions and build something new. The struggle goes on. They can be defeated, but they always rise up. Right? The defeat doesn't last forever. The bad guys don't always get away with this. And I think that we have ways of combating nationalisms, new and old. And one of those is by recognizing who the bad guys are, who gets rich off of us, right? Who exploits us? Why is our labor, why is our work going to make Jeff Bezos so rich and let Elon Musk and these guys go to Mars? Like, come on. Right? I mean, we can rise up, and we can go. We can pull together solidarity strong enough to defeat this billionaire class. So I'm optimistic.
Well, I would close by just by saying that being a pessimist frees you from disappointment, and doesn't necessarily mean that you hope for the worst, but only that anything even minimally good, like this, for example, this fascinating discussion in this wonderful fora that is Feria Internacional del Libro de Guadalajara, is proof of gems coming out from even the darkest moments that we are living in. Thank you both so much. This has been really thought-provoking. I will go back to this session. I made many notes, and I hope our audience will also look more into what both of you have written and continue to write. Jodi, I know you're active on Twitter. Todd, I'm not sure if I found you on social media. I believe not. But I hope to, well, at least you're free from that. I definitely hope to have a chance to continue this conversation sometime again in the future. Thank you again so much for sharing your thoughts, your wisdom, and also your hope with us.
Thank you, Gabriel.
Thank you.
Thank you, y muchas gracias a la FIL por esta invitación. Los esperamos muy próximamente, pero yo los invito a que revisen muy bien esta sesión, piensen, reflexionen y no dejen nunca de criticar. Gracias.